Thank you very much, and don't forget, this video was made possible by my patrons on Patreon. Want to support me? The link is on the screen. Sincerely yours, VisualPony, and enjoy this audiobook. The Lunar Cypher, Chapter 15. Unpleasant Surprises. Seeing the dawn from the inside of a cloud was something I hadn't experienced before. It was interesting and pretty and didn't take my mind off of the coming battle for an instant. I was blind to what was going on with the rest of the fleet and had to trust that every pony else was doing their jobs according to plan. I was also figuratively blind to what exactly we were going to be facing. I had made some educated guesses based on my knowledge and experience, and my commanders and Luna had all agreed that my assumptions were logical, but not knowing for sure made me a bit nervous. For a few moments, I wished that the rainbow power could have made it all go away. But I'd learned from hard experience what sort of situations the power worked best in, and fighting through an army of monsters to eliminate an area of dark contamination was fraught with too many variables. There was way too much that could go wrong. Even my relatively simple rescue of Cherie had turned into a diplomatic nightmare. No, it worked best on friendship problems, most particular problems that it had pointed out itself in Pony&Wolf Castle at the map. The simple and easy solution was not an option. I won't say that I was unreasonably keyed up, but when Luna teleported to my side, I might have jumped and gasped just a little bit. "Now, my love," Luna said, and then kissed me and teleported away with my pilot and engineer in tow, leaving me alone on board. I grabbed the vent line and pulled hard, opening the big flap at the top of Hasina's envelope that spilled hot air out into the cold morning sky. The deck dropped beneath my hoofs and the wooden hull creaked in an alarming way as I released the line and pulled back on the levers that controlled power to the propulsive fins. I had to ramp up speed slowly because the old vanes were delicate and throwing them into full ahead might snap one or more of them if it didn't break some other part of the linkage mechanism first. Or I might stall one of the engines and, without an engineer to restart it, I would be in big trouble. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. I throttled up slowly and Hasina began to move forward. As she dropped out of the cloud, I got my first view of the battlefield. The ruined city was off the port beam and the black pit was clearly visible. I turned the wheel to the left, chanting, "Don't oversteer, don't oversteer," to myself. The weather Pegasi had gotten me pretty close to the target, considering that they had to stop adjusting the course of the clouds an hour or so before dawn. The plan had been for Solar Flare to begin a long straight run at the city from several miles out, lit by the rising sun and flying her parade banners just to make herself as obvious as possible. If they reacted as they had before, the monsters capable of flight would go charging at her as soon as they were aware of her presence, leaving the way clear for me to drop Hasina into the cavern of the Dark Crystal. I could hear the roar of Solar Flare's engines somewhere behind me, but didn't have time to look around to see what was happening to her, because I was almost immediately attacked by a force of flyers that had remained over the city. They looked like Pegasi drenched in tar. I threw bolts of magics through them as quickly as possible, but there were too many for me to down them all before they reached me, and there were undoubtedly many more hidden from my view by the hull of the ship. The dark magic-soaked pit was the closest thing they had to a home or a base, and protecting the point of their creation seemed like a logical thing to do. The blast of a horn from above me was a signal that Even Star had dropped out of her cloud and was moving into position, and I cast a shield around Hasina as I pulled down my dark goggles. The ship began to slow and her turn softened as the airflow around her got sluggish from pushing through my shield. Then the magical bolts from Even Star began to streak by me, picking off my attackers. The flashes of light made keeping on target even more difficult, but I had held off on the countermeasures long enough to get roughly on course for the pit. I squinted into the glare and eased off on the wheel a bit. 2 long and 1 short blast from the horn was a signal that the monsters had mostly given up on Hasina and were turning their attention to Even Star. I waited a few seconds, then dropped my shield and vented more hot air. The sky between Hasina and the pit was clear of flyers, and I had managed to straighten out on a good line to take me directly over the hole. Soon I was close enough to make out the shattered remains of the enchanted dome that Celestia had created to contain my little mistake.
Too bad I'm better at messing up than she is at cleaning up,
I thought grimly to myself. I also caught sight of several huge, lumpen creatures that surrounded the pit and the swarms of crawling sinks that circled them, but they were all obviously incapable of flight, and the big ones didn't look like they were preparing to generate more flyers, so I felt it was safe to ignore them for the moment. And a moment was all I needed. The little brass dials that indicated my speed and altitude came to the readings that were perfect for my estimated distance from the pit, and I took hold of the 2 lines marked with red flags and pulled hard. My stomach tried to jump up into my throat as a full third of the top of Hasina's envelope tore away and she began plummeting downward. As the deflating envelope began to shake and flutter loudly above me, I reached out with my magic and turned the valves on the iron tank at the center of my device that would start the mixing of the alchemical reagents. I waited until I felt the surge of magic start to build before I threw myself over the stern rail and caught air with my wings, following in Hasina's wake just long enough to make sure she was on target before banking sharply away. I really didn't want to be anywhere near the pit when the detonation happened. I streaked over the desert, looked around for Even Star, spotted her, still engaged with dark flyers, and I began to call up a teleport spell. Suddenly, I sensed danger from my left. Air pressure, some unusual sound, or motion caught out of the corner of my eye. I couldn't be sure what had alerted me, but I began to turn to face whatever it was, and everything went dark. I came back to consciousness lying on a pile of rubble and sand. I tried to get up, screamed, and lay still again. I clenched my teeth and tried to breathe as shallowly as possible. The first thing I needed to do was dull the pain. I was helpless until I was mobile again. I called up my magic and cast the simplest palliative spell I knew. Fortunately, it seemed that I still had plenty of power to work with. With my head a bit clearer, I cast a second, more comprehensive spell and felt my armor resonate in sympathy, adding to the effect. I moved again and tested my legs. Nothing broken that I could detect. Good. I got to my hoofs and staggered as a wave of nausea hit me. Rather than resist, I dropped my head and expelled the remnant of my simple breakfast of oatcakes. When my nausea passed, I cast a simple shield around myself that wavered and flickered but held, then looked around to assess my situation. I was somewhere in the city. The pile of stones I had landed on was a collapsed wall. For all I knew, it might have been my impact that had collapsed it.
Poor old town,
I thought.
I sure am rough on you.
I took several deep breaths, trying to get more oxygen to my brain and hoped that lack of same, rather than brain damage, was why I felt like giggling. It seemed to work, because my next thoughts were a little more sensible. Where were the airships? Had the device detonated yet? If it had, why was there no giant column of smoke and ash in the sky? And, oh yeah, what the flippin' hay had happened to me? Engines. I could hear engines. That was a good sign. I stretched out my wings and gave a few tentative flaps. Unsurprisingly, they hurt. But it wasn't too bad and nothing seemed to be broken. I wasn't going to trust them to full-out flight, but I could at least get up high enough to see over the walls. I wobbled up and perched on the most stable structure I could see, which was tall columnar pedestal that must have once supported a statue. In the distance to the west I could see the solar flare blasting away at the cloud of monsters around her. If Luna had thought the ship was in any danger, she would have ordered Shining Armor to raise a shield, so I felt safe in assuming that her part of the battle was going well. The airship had cupulas set all over her that, between them, were able to fire on any point on her surface. Except under the heaviest of attacks, she should stay buttoned up and pick off her enemies at her leisure. I turned around carefully on the small surface of the pedestal and saw Even Star headed straight for me about 300 feet up and 5 furlongs away. That explained why the engine sound was so loud. They must have seen me fall and were coming after me. That meant I couldn't have been unconscious for all that long. There was a cloud of skirmishing Pegasi and monsters swirling around her, and no shield. Bolts of magic from her firing ports were knocking black creatures out of the sky at a rapid rate. All good signs. I was trying to assess if I was focused enough to attempt a short teleport spell when a large spinning black mass rose from somewhere beyond the buildings at high speed and hit Even Star amidships, just above her gondola. I only got a brief glimpse of whatever it was because it tore straight through her envelope and fell out the other side, carrying a tangle of wires and shredded fabric along with it. Even Star slewed around wildly, pitched her nose up, and began to fall. I didn't sink, I just reacted. I threw myself off the wall and flapped hard for altitude, ignoring the shooting pains in my left wing and shoulder. All of Even Star's skirmishers who could do so without fatally turning their backs on their enemies broke away and darted for the crippled airship. Hatches along her sides slammed open at the same time as tons of water dropped down from her ballast tanks, and her engines roared in a frantic effort to keep herself level. If she went further down by the stern, she'd lose all lift from her control surfaces and would drop like an anvil. The Pegasi snatched ponies from the hatches and dove for the ground as smoothly and perfectly as if they were merely practicing an abandoned ship drill, instead of frantically trying to save their shipmates. But Even Star had begun her fall at almost exactly the worst altitude and speed for a crash. High enough to kill, but low enough that parachutes wouldn't work. There was too little time to evacuate all her non-Pegasi crew. I dropped my shield and quickly shot down a dozen or so of the monsters, freeing up the Pegasi who had been fighting them for the evacuation effort. But I could see that it wasn't going to be anywhere near enough. Even Star had slowed her fall after the first ballast dump, but as she spun I could see the number 4 gas cell was completely destroyed, number 3 was rapidly deflating, and she was already beginning to fall faster. I quickly ran through a number of possibilities and came up with only one that had any hope of working. It wasn't a good plan. In fact, it was outright crazy. I swooped down to the ground, skidded to a stop, lit my horn, and tried to catch the airship. In the first instant I took up the weight, I nearly passed out. Stabbing pain shot through my head and I gasped out, staggered, but kept on pouring as much power into my telekinesis as possible in the faint hope that I might slow the crash enough to do some good. Even Star slowed and leveled, bits of wreckage falling away from her to crash in the dry dirt many precious seconds before the gondola itself slammed into the ground. It made an awful cacophony as it hit. Support girders shrieked and groaned as they bent and twisted, and shattering glass added a high counterpoint to the percussive crackle of hull plates warping and crumpling. The ruined envelope deformed, sagging to one side as a huge cloud of fine dust was thrown into the air. But I had done some good. It was a crash landing, but not a fatal one. As the dust began to settle, I could make out ponies helping others down from the hatches. I staggered forward on my hooves, not trusting my wings enough to fly, desperately searching the crowd for my friends. Pinkie Pie's bright color caught my eye as she and the rest came trotting around the smoking pile of wreckage that used to be the port engine nacelle. But we were still under attack, and I didn't have time for tearful reunions. As soon as the unicorns got clear of the ship, they began to fire upwards at the remaining dark flyers. That was a good idea. I sat and raised my head, then waited for the blurry, multiple images of monsters to come into focus, before I began throwing bursts of my own. It was only a minute or two before we'd cleared the skies. And that's when the groundlings came for us. The unicorns turned their horns on the insect-like scuttling horrors that swarmed out of the ruins. But there were so many of them that they had no chance to form a decent line of defense before they were in among us and slashing away with their claws and fangs. The Pegasi hovered and lashed out with their katos, but the long, stinger-tipped tails and some of the monsters could reach them in the air as they came close enough to strike. I belatedly cast a shield around our general area, trying to exclude as many monsters as possible without trapping any of my ponies outside. Then I shouted,
Fall back to Even Star! Get your backs to her hull!
I grabbed a couple of ponies that had fallen under their attackers with my telekinesis and shoved them back through the open hatches as I backed away from the creatures. I'm sure my rough transport would have horrified a doctor or medic, but leaving them under the claws of the creatures would have been worse. We began to get into some semblance of good order, and I was considering changing tactics when I realized that the monsters were making a particular focused effort to take me down. Suddenly, as if they had been given a signal, the biggest and fattest ones all came at me at once. I burned down a half-dozen before a snake-like creature whipped its coil around my forelegs and threw me to the ground. I killed it, but the one behind it was already striking, its dripping stinger arrowing at my face. That's when Pinkie Pie cut it in half.
Yeah, ye scary dogs! You'll not be touching me friend Twilight!
She growled around the hilt of the cutlass in her mouth. She lifted her eye patch to give me a wink and then piled into another knot of charging monsters on my right. If it had been any pony but Pinkie, I would have assumed I was hallucinating. As I got to my hooves, Rarity and Applejack ran by me, breaking up the creatures on my left. Applejack slammed into them, rearing and bucking, using pure brute force to send them flying. Rarity looked like she was dancing, first on 4 legs, then on 2, her hoofs landing with precision and power, each strike sending a creature to the ground. We were turning the tide, but I could see another wave of creatures slamming against my hasty shield from the outside. I poured more power into the shield and then began blasting monsters again. If we could get rid of the creatures inside with us, I would have enough strength to be able to hold the rest at bay until Solar Flare arrived and rescued us. That was the plan anyway. Yeah, me and my plans. I downed another couple of opponents and then whirled around when I heard the pony scream,
Look out!
The warning hadn't been directed at me, and it took me a second to locate the threat. A Pegasus was pointing up at an angle into the sky beyond my shield, and when I followed the line of her foreleg, I saw a large, tumbling black shape headed right for us. I frantically reinforced my shield only a second before it hit. The shield held, but it was a close thing, and I felt a powerful wave of nausea after using the sudden burst of power. The black shape rebounded from the energy barrier and fell into the ruins with a loud crash. I could clearly see it then, after it stopped moving. It was a black pyramidal shape. To be specific, it was a tetrahedron. Some of the creatures must have survived the battle at Ironwood Pass and returned to the main group. The Pegasus shapes, and now the attempt to physically imitate my buzzsaw shield attack made it a certainty. We had to finish them off. If we didn't, what would we be facing next? Airships made of living dark magic? Beyond the mass of creatures piled up outside my shield, I could see a huge black shape rising into the air. It was a long, thick limb of black flesh, cradling another tetrahedron. A living catapult. Astoundingly quickly for its size, it arced upwards and flung its payload at us. I flew up and passed through the shield in order to be able to cast spells beyond it. I could have simply put more power into it, but that was wasteful. It took a lot more strength to directly oppose an impact than it did to deflect one. I cast another shield, this time in tetrahedral form, slightly off center of the black pyramid's path. When it hit the angled surface of my shield, the spinning mass jerked slightly to one side. I dispelled the little shield, watching to see if I would need to repeat the process. Luckily, the shot went wide enough that it missed the main shield and plowed into the desert to one side. The giant arm sank down again and I could see another tetrahedron starting to grow on its end. Another wave of nausea twisted in my head, throat and chest, and I wondered how long I would be able to keep blocking the catapult shots, particularly if any more flyers showed up. Then I suddenly realized that the catapult creature was one of the huge black shapes I had seen at the edge of the pit. I was certain that, even if my sonic structures for focusing the blast upwards had been near perfect, the detonation of the device aboard Hazina would have collapsed the edges of the crater at the very least. Something had gone wrong and the device hadn't activated. But if I could force an explosion to happen, it might get rid of the biggest immediate danger we faced. At that point, it was a gamble I was willing to take. I couldn't feel the device from where I was, but I had designed and assembled it all myself and knew every piece of it very well indeed. So I knew that if I removed the plates that divided the central iron tank, the two reagents that were creating a flow of magic by mixing together at a few drops at a time would flow together all at once. The resulting power surge would overwhelm the waveguides and the cancellation wouldn't be perfect, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I dove down into the big shield again and used the royal voice to warn every pony about what was going to happen.
Big explosion in 5 seconds! Look away from the crater!
Then, loudly, I counted down from 5 and cast an object-specific teleport spell. The separator plate appeared on the sand at my hoofs. The sky lit up like the sun had come to Earth. The flare must have incinerated everything near the pit, even before the shockwave hit us. Considering how near we were, it was probably a good thing that the blast wasn't nearly as big as I had expected. As it was, the ground shock tossed every pony off their hoofs and the forward end of Evenstar's envelope crumpled and caved in on itself. But there was no big air blast and no directed energy blazing up into the sky. That meant that, somewhere along the way in my chain of assumptions, something wasn't right. Then all the dark creatures began to eerily wailing and turning and tried to claw their way out through my shield. I started to get nervous again. At least we weren't under attack any longer. With their backs turned, we made short work of the remaining monsters. Captain Zephyr got the crew organized to care for the wounded and Lieutenant Stormfeather began a damage assessment of Evenstar. Captain Lightning Lance set up flares of magic light just under the apex of the shield to signal solar flare that we were no longer under attack, but still needed assistance, and I thought seriously about having a little lie down for a week or so.
"All there?"
Applejack's voice came from somewhere off to my left.
"Wasn't that a fine dice-up?"
Indeed it was. I only wish it wasn't so horridly dirty and hot here. I'm sure I am a frightful mess.
"Rarely, I just cannot figure how a mare as pretty as you can swing such a mean hoof. Seriously, gal, y'all must have got nearly as much of them as I did."
Exercise is boring, dear. So years ago I took up martial arts to keep my figure trim and found I rather enjoyed it. And I don't mean to be contentious, but I'm sure I actually defeated several more of these unfortunate creatures than you did.
Huh. Well, I reckon y'all ain't as good at counting as you are at fighting.
Oh? Well, maybe you should look over the field, There, those 3 are mine, and there are 2 more over there.
Scrawny little things. Not like the big one over there that I took out.
Sorry, darling, but I believe that one's mine too.
I ain't neither. Look at the way its head that's caved in. That's a classic tree-shaking buck if ever.
Arrest me, hearties! What be there Habba Spooty?
Pinky, dear, whatever are you talking about? And where did you get that ridiculous outfit?
I suppose they all stopped their genial bickering because they were a bit concerned by my painful, ragged laughter. A moment later, Fluttershy was at my side, trying to support me and waving something blurry and yellow in front of my face.
How many feathers am I holding up?
Stop moving your wing around and let me count. I grinned.
A square root of 36 or 3 fractional. Take your pick.
I told her.
Yup,
Applejack drawled.
she's normal.
Well, normal for Twilight.
Rarity amended. Fluttershy frowned.
That is 6, isn't it?
Just then, Lieutenant Stormfeather came trotting up.
Your Highness, solar flares approaching. They have flown signals asking for you to come aboard.
I sighed.
We don't have a series of flares for I'm too tired to fly or teleport, do we?
He thought for a second.
The closest I can get to that is unable to comply or unable to maneuver.
This might be misinterpreted. I wouldn't want to worry Luna.
If you'll drop the shield, ma'am, I'll send a messenger, but they'll be here in another 5 or 6 minutes anyway.
I dispelled the shield.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
About 2 minutes later, Luna appeared next to Evenstar's bridge and looked around for me.
Over here.
I called out to her.
I'm okay, and so are... Oof!
Luna teleported to my side and grabbed me in a big hug. I wheezed a bit and gritted my teeth against the pain, but there was no way I was going to tell her to let go.
Do you know what is happening in the pit?
She asked, loosening her hold on me just enough to be able to look me in the face.
I had to detonate the device manually.
I told her.
I don't know if it absorbed all the dark magic or not, but the monsters seem to be pretty upset about it. Yes, they all fled right after the explosion. As for the crater, seen from solar flare, there is still activity inside. Magical activity, and not a little as far as I can sense.
I nodded. I was exerted, so I'd have to go see for myself. My nice lie down receded into the uncertain future.
Take me up, will you? I'm pretty exhausted, and send down the medical staff. We've got lots of woundeds that need attention.
We appeared a second later on Solar Flare's bridge. Luna left me there while she went about shuttling medics down to Evenstar's landing site, and I asked Captain Falconheart to fill me in. He led me to one of the big pivoted telescopes and let me look for myself.
The explosion didn't happen as you predicted, but at least it took out those catapult creatures. There were several smaller eruptions down in the pit afterwards, and the monsters all headed towards the hole and began throwing themselves in,
he said. I gave an acknowledging grunt as I peered through the scope. I couldn't see any of the dark creatures at all, but the glowing aurorae of magical discharges were still flickering in the crater. They didn't look much like dark magic, which was puzzling. My alchemical engine should have expended all of its energy within seconds of the reagents mixing. Something was very wrong.
Don't fly over the pit,
I said, not looking up from the telescope.
In fact, don't get closer than a couple of furlongs and take us up another 1,000 feet.
I wasn't going to take any chances with the last vessel that could get us all home.
Yes, Your Highness.
Luna popped back onto the bridge and I heard hoofballs on the deck as the other crew moved away from me.
Twilight,
she said in almost a whisper.
Are you well enough to do this? Your young lieutenant told me that you were struck by one of those catapult shots.
I looked up from the scope.
Is that what it was? I never saw what got me. That was one heck of a good shot to hit a target as small as me.
Despite my light tone, Luna looked horrified.
Do you not wish to have the doctor examine you? Do you not have pains you would faint be eased off? It's okay, really. I'm mostly just exhausted.
I hesitated, not wanting to worry her.
But I wouldn't say no to some painkillers, and if I can get me something that will give me some temporary energy, that would be great.
Luna brought a medic to me, who took one look at me and insisted I immediately go to bed and be sedated. She was very young and very earnest. I did not laugh at her and did not snap at her, though I felt conflicting urges to do both. I pointed out the forward ports with a wingtip.
Out there is an unknown, uncontrolled medical reaction that has to be treated as an imminent threat of possible horrific magnitude. I'm the only pony aboard who has a chance of understanding what's happening and putting a stop to it. Do you still want me to go take a nap? I'm sorry, Princess. Don't be. You're undoubtedly correct in your recommendations. Just can't afford to follow them right now.
She nodded, turned and nosed open the flap of her saddlebags, and then held out a tiny flask to me.
This is the best stimulant I have. Drink half of it now. If you need more after 2 hours, drink half of what's left. But no more than that. It's dangerous in larger quantities. And be very careful. You'll feel wonderful, but you'll still be injured and tired. When it wears off, no power in Equestria will keep you awake.
I drank the first half right away and then tucked the flask inside my breastplate.
So, I've got about 3 hours before lights out? About that, yes, Your Highness. Ha! I'll have this sorted out in 10 minutes flat.
I blinked.
Hey, this stuff works fast.
It was odd I should have picked that amount of time, because that was almost exactly how much I had left.
Author's note. Thanks once again to Academic Pony and Status for the editing and critique. And a special thanks to Outcast9851 for advice on military protocol and operations. Some readers have expressed doubts that Rarity is a good fighter as I've depicted her here. My answer? She has shown the will and ability to seriously kick ass several times in the show. She's not just a simple girly girl.
Comment time!
Okay, first of all, I must remind you that you can support me via my Patreon. The link is in the description. Every dollar helps, is needed, and is very much appreciated. And then I want to say here in the author's notes, when I saw that my answer, there are several screenshots from the show where Rarity is kicking ass. Like in the season 1 opener, where she attacks a manticore, kicks a manticore, or in Return of Harmony, where Applejack is touching Tom, the boulder that Rarity mistakes for a diamond, a giant diamond, that she actually kicks Applejack in the face and then stands there in a martial arts pose. Then we have a screenshot of Rarity hitting a changeling and grinning. The other is from the episode where I think Dragon Quest was the episode name, where she threatens those dragons that if they touch one scale on Spike's head, she'll rip them apart. And that last screenshot, I seriously have no idea from which episode that is, but it looks strange, because it depicts Rarity standing on one hoof, and kicking upwards with her left rear leg so high that it's above her nose. And if I see that correctly, there's Twilight in the background there, but I can't be sure. So, but yeah, I do agree. Rarity can kick ass if she wants to, even though I'm not really a fan of Rarity. And now to my comments about this chapter. Yeah, as I said in the previous comment time, there was much that could have gone wrong here, and one of those things actually happened. Even Star was sunk. And, yeah, Twilight tried to catch an airship. Wow. I don't know. But that seems kinda badass. Even though, I must say, I am a nurse. I'm a trained nurse, as many of you know. And all I can say is, that medic there is right. Twilight has to get some sleep. Seriously. I mean, how long is she awake now? The only thing that she's gotten so far is a little bit of magical sleep that Luna gave her, which isn't the same as an 8-hour sleep. She has been hit by a fucking catapult. So her body needs the time to recuperate. Especially because if you imagine, she explains it at the end here with unknown medical reaction and impending doom and I don't know what else. When you're overly tired, you're prone to make mistakes. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some rest, even if it's only an hour or so. Because, oh my god. She doesn't have to go and sleep for like 10 or 12 hours or 8 hours even. But 1 hour, that would be really good. That would give her a bit of energy. I think most of us know this feeling that when you're totally tired, you sleep an hour and then for a short while after that, you have energy to do stuff. That's what I would recommend here. Because quite frankly, I would put more confidence in Luna being able to deal with any situations that might arise while she sleeps. That's another part here. Twilight seriously thinks that she's the only pony who could stop anything bad from happening here. And that's just not true. She has a very powerful and very intelligent alicorn with her. Even though I doubt that Luna would understand the intricacies of Twilight's device, I still think that she would still be able to do something if anything went majorly wrong. And we have seen in the show what happens when Twilight is totally exhausted. I mean, does anyone remember that line, "Put the hay in the apple and eat the candle"? On that note, we'll see what will happen here. Twilight says that she has about 10 minutes left. I'm not looking forward to this. Sincerely yours, VisualPony, and we will see each other next chapter.